Howdy, everybody. Good morning to you all three of you that are in here right now. How's everybody doing today? Just waiting on more people to join. We got 8 people in here right now, so we'll give it another couple minutes before I get started. Good to hear. Victor, Lords, Ireland, excellent. Andy, doing okay? We'll take it. Mahul, I am doing just fine. It is another scorcher here today. It is going to be a warm one. The current weather, slight haze, maybe moderate visibility. Can't really see the mountains too well today. But I suspect that as the day moves on, the clouds will vanish, revealing golden sunshine and bright blue skies. Very good. Jenna, good to hear it. Well, got 12 people in here. Still missing a handful. Couple of notes to once again remind you that today is Wednesday, tomorrow is Thursday. which means that I will be flying out of town tomorrow. Now, normally we won't meet tomorrow anyway because it's an even day, but on Friday there will be still an assignment for you. And everything will be posted at the appropriate time on Canvas on Friday morning so that you will be able to do what you need to do. Today we are going to cover a lot of ground to finish up the late Middle Ages and move into the Renaissance period. And so this is a good class, good content in this class. We're going to be looking at some primary resources today as well of early humanism, and looking at some resources from Petrarch, who's considered the father of humanism, as well as Pico della Mirandola, who was another humanist writer from that time, poet, I guess you could say. So let's go ahead and get started. I am going to be on the late Middle Ages PowerPoint right now. I am on slide 7, talking about the 100 Years' War. So if you already have this PowerPoint on your computer, you can just open that up, or if you want, you can go back to Canvas and it's in the lecture PowerPoints folder. So go ahead and do that right now. I'll give you a second to do that. Can we finish last time's homework? Will it be considered as late if it's turned in today? The due date for the work always comes at 11:59 p.m. on the date that it is due. So if you didn't finish the reading questions for today yet, you can still hand those in and get full credit. Just understand that if it's not handed in by the time that I go through to put them in the grade book, it is not going to get added until next week. So not to say that it'll be late necessarily, but it just will show up that it's missing until I have a chance to sit down and go over it. But it's going to be a very busy next few days for me as I'm flying out of town and doing a bunch of stuff for my sister's wedding. So just know that. All right. Talking about the 100 Years' War, hopefully you have this pulled up in front of you now. As I said, I'm on slide 7. The 100 Years' War was a series of ongoing conflicts between England and France from 1337 to 1453. Remember, it's not 100 straight years of warfare. This is where Edward III of England made a claim on the French throne when his uncle, a guy named Charles IV of France, died. And the thing about this was that Edward III was the grandson, or a grandson, of Philip the Fair of France, who was a previous ruler. And so he has kind of a weak claim against the French throne. But one of the things that happens back in the olden days during the feudal era is that king's power is constantly being challenged by other people. And when you have a person who makes a claim against the throne, they become known as a pretender, okay, a pretender. And sometimes pretenders can ultimately end up like waging war and taking over and becoming the actual king, although their reign would probably be disputed by others who were loyal to the previous dynasty. So it's but for kings, there's not a whole lot of other things that you can do, right? Your job is to try to increase the size of your domain. And so Edward III makes this claim on France, all right? French nobles instead chose Philip VI, who was a cousin, cousin of Charles IV, whose dynasty then continued to rule all the way into the 16th century. So these were dynastical wars, largely, between Britain and, not even Britain, I'm sorry, England and France. England doesn't start to become known as Britain until 1707 with something called the Act of Union. So we are talking about England, not Britain right now. And as we move on, and I kind of talked a little bit about this last time, France was much larger than England. They had a much larger population, and it is geographically larger as well. And they're also far wealthier. France being positioned in continental Europe and England being an island meant that France was better positioned for continental trade with some of the other major trading partners around Europe at that time, including Antwerp, which is in now modern day Belgium, and then of course the Italian states. So France had a little bit more access to trade. They were definitely wealthier. They were fighting on their own land, which is always an advantage because you're defending rather than aggressing the fight. And then also keep in mind that France is pretty decentralized at this time. They have a very fractured feudal government. And if you were to look at a map of France, a lot of times France gets divided into areas like Aquitaine and Brittany and other places like that, whose local lords had a lot more influence than the actual king of France did. And they have kind of mediocre leadership. England, by comparison already, is a little bit more centralized. There's reasons for that. England, going back to 1215, had passed a document called the Magna Carta, which essentially prevented the English king from being able to tax arbitrarily without the consent of the nobles in Parliament. And Parliament worked a little different back in those days. Parliament was not like it is today, where it meets every day and people are voted on to serve in Parliament. But the people who served in Parliament back in the olden days were nobles from all across the stretches of England who would travel long distances once a year, maybe a couple times a year at most, to meet up with the king and other nobles and discuss taxation and wars and other things like that. Now, Edward III faced some challenges on his death. And that goes back to kind of the whole idea about kings' reigns being disputed by pretenders. Okay, and we're going to get to that in a second. Militarily, the English were known for having a particular military unit called longbowmen. And longbowmen were archers who used longbows and were very effective, very, very effective in battles. And at the time, at one point, England actually owned, or not owned, but held several territories in France, particularly northern France, in an area known as Normandy. If you've ever heard of Normandy before, it's probably because of the Battle of Normandy in 1944, D-Day, landing on, Normandy Beach, Omaha, Utah, sword, Juno, gold. Those were the five things where the Allied powers invaded onto Normandy Beach. Normandy was named after the Duke of Normandy, who actually conquered England in 1066. And Britain had a lot of French influence for a long time. And even today, there are many words in the English language that are French influenced, not the least of which is Renaissance. So, which we're getting to later today. A little bit of a background on England. Like I said, 1215, the Magna Carta forced the king to share power with nobility in Parliament. The way that Parliament works today, it's similar to the U.S. Congress. There's two houses. In our Congress, we don't call them these things. We call them the Senate and the House of Representatives. The Senate being the upper house, the House of Representatives being the lower house. But in Parliament, the houses were known as the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And both of these houses, really, to be honest with you, contain mostly nobility. Even though they call it the House of Commons, it was still made up of nobles. It was just slightly lesser ranked nobles than the House of Lords, who were very highly ranked nobles. Parliament steadily gained power over time because good kings were usually able to cooperate with Parliament. Parliament wasn't so, Parliament was the nobles in Parliament were perfectly willing to help fund a war so long as the king essentially asked nicely. Okay, but any time that we started to see contention between the king and Parliament, problems arise. But for the most part, Parliament is kind of gaining power over time because the king is forced to kind of have this kind of decorum of getting along with Parliament, not taxing them without their consent and stuff like that. Now, as we move on to slide 10, the 100 Years' War, in the early going, there were a lot of English victories. And on this slide, I'm not going to go into all the battles of the 100 Years' War because, frankly, it's not that important and I don't have time for it. But if you want to read more about it, it is in your textbook and it's in this PowerPoint here. Okay, but as time goes on, England ends up facing some problems. Probably the most important was the Battle of Portier, and this was in 1356. This is England's greatest victory in the 100 Years' War, where they captured the French king, who was named John II, John the Good. Okay, and this left France in control of the Estates General, a body of nobles, clergy, and townsfolk who bullied peasants, and it resulted in a series of rebellions known as the Jacquerie. As time goes on, you can see here on the next slide, on slide 11, how over time, 1337, 1360, 1429, 1453, you can see that England, has a number of different successes, particularly early on, where they end up actually holding quite a bit of territory within continental Europe in France. And, and as I said, like you can see in green on some of these maps, some of these regions kind of break away from French control. Burgundy, for example, who ended up allying with England and stuff like that. So, it's interesting to see how during this nearly century-long conflict that kind of starts and stops and starts and stops again, that England was really very, very close to capturing France and making France an English possession. But things end up kind of going a little haywire in England. So let's talk about this. One of the things I mentioned, and something that will become increasingly important for excuse me. One of the things that will become increasingly important for you guys to understand, essentially, if you're an English king or any king, it doesn't really matter if you're the king of England or anywhere else, kings have one major priority. There is one thing that is more important than anything else if you are a feudal, medieval king. And that is having a son, okay? And preferably a few sons, all right? You want to have a few different sons because in order for your dynasty to be able to continue to move on through the generations, due to patrilineal descent and various other things, man, I've got like this tickle in my throat. Due to patrilineal descent, as well as primogeniture, inheritance laws, you need to have a son, and it's good to have a few sons because remember, just being wealthy in this time didn't make you immune from illness. I mean, illness, tragedy struck families no matter what background that you were from. As a king, you were every bit as likely to get sick as a peasant, and or be victim to whatever natural disaster or wars or what have you. So you need to have a few sons because there's not a guarantee in this time that your kids are going to be able to make it to adulthood. However, one of the things that becomes a problem is if you have too many sons. And this was what was the scenario with Edward III, who really was the one who initiated this 100 Years' War conflict against France. Edward III had a bunch of sons, but remember that the title of king only passes down to the eldest son. So if you have a bunch of sons, let's say 6, 7, 8 sons, each of those sons ends up growing up and having a bunch of their own sons, which very, very quickly proliferates the number of pretenders that you will potentially be fighting against to hold on to your title of the regal figure of England or wherever. Okay, so Edward III has a bunch of sons. These sons live to adulthood and end up having their own sons who end up having their own sons. And so within a few generations, you have a whole lot of kind of, basically everybody is the same relation to Edward III. All of them are equally related if you really think about it. But a lot of these descendants now start thinking to themselves, well, maybe I would be a better king than the one who is, has the rightful descendant claim to the throne. And so within England, you have people who are vying to discredit the current king, make a claim against the English throne and want to be king because it's good to be king, right? So Richard II was the grandson of Edward III. I'm now on slide 13. And Richard II faced problems from France, and he had kind of stormy relationships with Parliament, and he also had no children, which is a problem. So if you don't have any kids, there's no clear line, a lineage of descent, right? And you have to find who the person is that's going to be the closest related, who would be the appropriate person. Well, he ends up getting overthrown in 1399 by a guy called Henry Bolingbroke, and he dies. So Henry Bolingbroke ends up becoming Henry IV, all right? And he was part of so here's the thing, this is where it gets a little bit confusing. Right now in England, we're in a dynasty known as the Plantagenet dynasty, okay? The Plantagenet dynasty was Edward III's descendants, okay? But within that dynasty, due to marriages and so on and so forth, people end up having different kind of like family names, okay? So you can be a relatively close family member with somebody else, but they'll have like, they're part of a different house, okay? Not a house, but like that's what they called it back in the olden days for nobles in England. But Henry was part of the House of Lancaster, okay? Which was one segment of the Plantagenet dynasty. There's also a segment known as the House of York, okay? And there's a reason that I'm setting this up for you, so I'll get to that in a second. So Henry IV was actually the cousin of Richard II. Henry IV ends up being a really successful king. He suppressed all opposition to his reign by the middle of it. And it ends up that he has a son, and his son, who ends up being Henry V, was even better. And so we're going to move on to him right now. And all the while, by the way, Henry IV, Henry V are reigning in England, this 100 Years' War is continuing with France. Now, Henry V ended up reviving kind of the glory period of Edward III. Edward III was a really good king. He was well liked. Things got a little hairy towards the end of his reign, but for the most part, people reflected fondly back on Edward III's reign. And he kind of revived the glory of that. And Henry V ends up winning a major victory late in the 100 Years' War against France, called the Isabella takeover before Henry IV. Yeah, you have to understand I'm on limited time, so I'm kind of like bullet pointing some things here. But suffice it to say, there was a major victory here at Agincourt, and Agincourt would have been kind of the nail in the coffin for France. But what ends up happening is that Henry V is literally riding out on horseback, okay, to make his claim on the French throne, quite literally take and put the French crown on his head and almost combine the the English and French thrones. Okay. And he ends up getting very, very sick with dysentery. And so basically he's riding on horseback, and he is, and I know this is a little bit like gross, but he's basically like diarrheaing himself to death as he's riding out on horseback, and dies. Now, and he wasn't that old either. I think he was only in his mid-30s. All right. Now, he did have a son, but he did have a son. However, the son was just an infant, and you can't have an infant running an entire, kingdom, especially when you're right at the tail end of a, century-long war with France. And so, for a period of time, there's a regent in charge under Henry VI, who was the son of Henry V, who died of dysentery. And basically, here's the story on Henry VI. I don't know if you can see some of these paintings here, okay? But if you look at the image of Henry VI, it's not just like it's a bad painting or something. You can tell that Henry VI is a little bit off balance just by looking at the artwork of him here. And so basically Henry VI is not the most genetically competent individual, and he's weak-minded. He ends up being pretty insane, actually, and he ends up financially absolutely devastating England. He ends up getting married to Margaret of Anjou. Now, Anjou is in France. And so, it's this, she's not well liked already because of the long-standing conflict between England and France. But nonetheless, she's also very, very, very manipulative. And she's pulling strings, and she knows, because her husband is really weak-minded, that she's able to kind of dominate and manipulate him and kind of become this puppet master of sorts. All right. Nevertheless, she's obviously quite politically savvy. So Henry VI reigned from 1422 to 1461, and he eventually ended up basically single-handedly causing England to lose the entire 100 Years' War. All right, really, really poor leadership at the tail end of it under Henry VI. His wife Margaret of Anjou and his great uncles were heavily manipulative of Henry VI. And meanwhile, in Joan of Arc, in France rather, you had Joan of Arc, who was a peasant from eastern France, and she presents herself to King Charles VII of France in 1429, declaring that God called her to stop the English siege of Orleans. She was a source of national pride for France, but ultimately ends up being labeled a heretic and is burned at the stake. And so, not a military genius. She is a woman of interest in history, but she's not like a Napoleon or something like that. The victories that she participated in were well timed. She ends up actually being captured by the Burgundians, which were French dissidents who had allied with the English in 1430. And Charles VII really does nothing to help secure her release. And of course, the English are looking to discredit Joan of Arc and her beliefs and turn her over to the Inquisition. So she gets interrogated for 10 weeks, where she ultimately ends up breaking down, gets charged with heresy, which is like anti-Christian devil worship sort of things, and is executed. And you can go to France, and I've been there, and see the very location where she was killed. And by 1453, the last place that the English actually continue to hold is Calais, which is right across the English Channel, and in very, very tip-top northern part of France. Okay, the last part of this slide talks about the Avignon papacy. I feel like I've talked about that a bit, Basically, the big parts of this is that there's a major split in the church. There's a pope, there's an anti-pope. This has to do with the College of Cardinals being largely made up of French cardinals. And then these French cardinals end up cutting their ties with Rome because they feel like they're being treated unfairly, and so on and so forth. The big idea behind the Avignon papacy will play a bigger role down the line when we get to Unit 2, talking about the Protestant Reformation. And the reason that it's a big deal is because the Avignon papacy is kind of a symptom, if you will, of problems that are brewing within the Roman Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church already is kind of infighting. There's a lot of corruption, and this schism or split in the church is indicative that there are going to be problems in the future. What it does is it decreases the prestige of the church. It makes the church seem like it's disorganized and dysfunctional, which, by the way, it very much was. And so that's really the big idea behind the Avignon papacy. Okay, and if you want to again read more about that, I encourage you to. But remember, I'm on very limited time here, so I got to kind of like move through this stuff here really quickly. And eventually the schism is resolved. It takes a while. It goes on and on for a period of time, but it does get resolved basically just in time to see more corruption take place and ultimately have the Protestant Reformation, where we see people break away from the church entirely. So, okay, I'm going to close out that late Middle Ages PowerPoint. And now if you go to the files section, you will now see a new PDF in there called renaissancefinal.pdf. And this is the next section of things that we're going to be working on today. So go ahead and open that up. And I'm going to open it up on my screen over here. And it is right here. Okay. So moving on to, so essentially what I just finished was chapter 11, which you should have already read and done the questions for in your book as recent as last Friday, okay? Or really, it was due this Monday. So I am now moving into the Renaissance chapter, which is chapter 12, and we're going to spend a little bit more time on this unit. I have to move kind of quickly through the late Middle Ages just to set things up enough for you so that you'll have an understanding of how things change with the Renaissance from how they were during the late Middle Ages. So go ahead, pull that up. I'm on it right now, and we are now going to move forward. Now, the first thing that I want to call your attention to on this screen here, on the very first slide where it says Renaissance and Discovery, is that we're looking at a piece of Renaissance art in the background. And one of the major features, of course, of the Renaissance, and let's be clear about what that word Renaissance means. In fact, why don't you do me a favor? Tell me, according to what you know, define the word Renaissance for me. Type it in the chat. What is the Renaissance, according to what you've read so far, that is? Rebirth. Yes. Rebirth of what, though? That's the big question. Renaissance is a rebirth. It does mean rebirth, but rebirth of what? There's a clue. I'll give you a hint. There's a clue in the piece there. Ireland says antiquity. That's a great answer. But what is antiquity? It's a rebirth of antiquity, but what's antiquity? Classical antiquity, yes, yes, yes. What is classical antiquity? You guys are totally right. I love that. That's really professional sounding. It's a rebirth of classical. When you guys go to Rome one day, you'll be able to like, yes, well, of course, the Renaissance was a period of time of rebirth of classical antiquity, and it'll make you sound really, really smart. But what is classical antiquity? Antiquity is old, it is ancient. So what features are we seeing reborn? Yes, Alicia, the Roman civilization, the period of time before the Middle Ages. That's right. Ancient Greco-Roman art, architecture, literature. It's a rebirth of culture from an age that's been gone for a very, very long time. So, if I was to ask you to identify some features of this particular piece here, okay, take a look at this particular piece. What do you suppose are some features demonstrated in this piece of art here that are emblematic, okay, of this rebirth of ancient Greco-Roman antiquity? Can you point to anything specific as evidence? Columns, good, good. The picture looks a lot more lively than before, where art in the Dark Ages, there is a lot of art in the Dark Ages that is about death and dying because, you know, obviously the Black Death had a profound influence on that. That is true. The figures look almost 3D. The figures relate well with the background. That is a feature of art of the Renaissance. And you're absolutely right about that because that's a new technique. And you're right. In Renaissance art, there's a lot more depth conveyed in the art because of a stylistic change where people are able to use linear perspective and shadows in order to convey a lot of depth in the piece. But I would not say that that's necessarily symbolic of ancient Rome. Somebody said columns. Let's stick with that. Columns. What else looks like it could be related to ancient Rome in this picture? The architecture, big time. Is that a piece of the Passover? It appears to be, yes. But I want to draw your attention to a couple of different things. At the top, the archway. Okay, do you see the arch? There's a huge arch that frames this picture. Okay, that is not by accident. That is very, very, very deliberate, right? Take a look at the background, the architecture in the background. The background images in the distance there are heavily, heavily Roman influenced. In fact, if you take a look at those buildings in the background, they have something called a triangular pediment at the top. They've got columns. They're made out of that kind of white marble material. Okay, you've got the archways, and then of course you've got sculptures built right into the tops of the columns and into the archways and things like that. And the Roman sculptures are some of the most abundant pieces of art that we have from that time of ancient classical art. And so, these features here, I want to draw your attention to something else. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but the buildings that are typically considered our governmental buildings here in the United States very much incorporate a lot of these same elements that you're seeing in this art in the 1400s. Now, wait a second, Mr. Knight. I thought that the United States didn't become a country until the Revolutionary War in 1776 when we declared our independence. That's absolutely right. Okay, that's absolutely right. So how come is it then that all of our governmental buildings, which were painted hundreds of years after this peace and thousands of years after the Roman Empire, how come they all incorporate these ancient antiquity classical elements to them? Well, there's a reason. The people who helped to found the country, okay, the founding fathers, if you will, were part of an intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment, which was an intellectual movement that was about trying to distinguish natural laws of how humans best function in society. And these natural laws could have been about lawmaking, it could have been about the government, it could have been about the judicial system, it could have been about crime and punishment. There's all sorts of different, it's about freedom, it's about liberty, it's about all of these different ideas, okay, that are coming about during this period of time known as the Enlightenment in the late 16 all the way through the 1700s, essentially. And because the Romans utilized in the early days a republican style of government where you had representative democracy and other things like that, and also because the Romans and the Greeks, even maybe more so because of guys like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, who were very philosophical, we were all inspired at that time by this Enlightenment movement, this philosophical movement that was happening at the time. And we started to put more of an emphasis on statecraft and building an optimum society and government that would help people flourish and all of these other things. And it was very much inspired by the ancient Greco-Roman societies from thousands of years earlier. So what did we do? We paid homage to ancient Greece and Rome and the architecture that symbolizes the democratic structures that they had there for a short time, and put it into our own buildings. So how come it shows up in Renaissance art? Well, the first time that we see an interest happen again at all in ancient Greece and Rome, keep in mind the Roman Catholic Church had really gone out of its way to try to destroy all remnants of the past, to stamp out paganism, to get rid of the ancient society of Rome, which became, it was told in stories that they were these really sinful, devil-worshipping. The Roman Catholic Church essentially tries to kind of downplay the role of the Roman Empire for about 1,000 years. Latin stops being spoken, people stop, and then a lot of art was destroyed as well. And so any art that was left over from ancient Rome was actually held over in the far southeastern territories of Europe, now what's known as Turkey, at the time being held by the Ottoman Empire, which was largely Muslim empire. And the Muslims, being, believe it or not, actually, a bit more diverse and tolerant, held on to a lot of these artifacts and had to reteach the Italians about ancient Roman, ancient Greco literature, art. They even had to reteach the math. Okay, there was people were by the time that we get to the late Middle Ages in Europe, really deficient at even basic skills. And it's the Ottomans that end up preserving a lot of this culture and trading it back to Italy via the Mediterranean Sea, where it starts to, among the upper echelons of the merchant societies of Italy, start to take an interest in some of these ancient elements of antiquity. And that's why we start to see it incorporated into art in Italy. Now, the original center of the Renaissance is Florence. And if you ever get a chance to go to Florence one day, it's one of the most favorite places in the world that I have ever been to. And I've been a lot of places. It is unbelievable. And it's really, really, really beautiful. And there's so much to see there. And it's an amazing city with amazing food. And it's just fantastic. I really, really enjoyed my time there. And so, but you can start to see, actually, believe it or not, and I know that this is going to sound a little bit weird because we usually associate features like those columns, those pillars, right? And the arches and domes and other things like that. We associate that with governmental buildings, secular buildings in our country. But believe it or not, in the early days, those features in Italy were incorporated into religious buildings. So, when you talk about the Vatican, for example, okay, there's a lot of at St. Peter's Basilica, there's a whole lot of the types of features that we would typically associate with a governmental building, but it's a cathedral, and they start using these ancient Greco-Roman architectural features in these religious buildings, which is pretty cool to see. So anyhow, as I said, Renaissance, French for rebirth, and it symbolized a major transition from medieval Europe to what we now will call Renaissance Europe. And the big idea here is this. I'm going to give you kind of two historical versions on how this argument works, all right? Now, the traditional argument about history with the Renaissance is that if we're thinking of it from the perspective of continuity versus change over time, some historians, many historians, argue that the Renaissance was a significant change, that the late Middle Ages were going for a while, and then something happens. There's a break. There's a new break, and we see a new historical period develop afterwards. Now, to be clear on this, I want to make sure that you guys understand that when I'm referring to this break, I'm not referring to something that's an isolated incident that changes everything. It's not quite like the type of break that, say, like a tragic event like 9/11 or something like that, signals. Nobody was waiting for the Renaissance to start, in whatever 1400, and they woke up and they're like, oh man, by golly, it's the Renaissance today. I can't wait to get outside. That didn't happen. Okay, the Renaissance, it's a transition. Okay, but nonetheless, the traditional historical argument is that things were going a certain way for a while. There's a transitionary phase, and that creates a break in history, and then we have a new phase that follows it. So that would be like change over time, and that's going to be probably mostly what I focus on because that's the most traditional argument to make for the Renaissance. However, to make sure that I demonstrate good historical thinking and argumentation skills, I am going to also pose to you that other historians have argued the opposite and have relatively good evidence to lend credibility to the argument that they make, which is to say that the Renaissance really wasn't as big of a break as people like to believe that it was, that perhaps the degree to which things changed from the Middle Ages has been over-exaggerated by historians in history, and that in fact a lot of the barbaric practices that were used in the late Middle Ages really continued right on through into the Renaissance. And while there may have been some developments in art or architecture or some changes here and there about things, that really you could make the argument that in the late Middle Ages there were also changes in art, and that the art developed over time, and that perhaps there were multiple Renaissances throughout the late Middle Ages that were precursors to what we now think of as the Renaissance. All right, so there are different, that's the point of what I'm trying to tell you is in history, think about history as almost kind of like that Rubik's Cube, that every time that you're on the verge of solving, all the colors change and somebody poses something completely different, and you're constantly resolving it. All right, that's the great thing about history in some sense. It's the thing that makes some people nuts because they don't like that. Some people are very mathematically oriented. They have a question, they want a concrete answer for it. But history's not about the concrete. It's very much about the abstract. And that's why I'm presenting you with these counter arguments of that historians have made about the Renaissance. Okay, so let's talk about some of these changes here. Medieval Europe, a fragmented feudal society, As we talked about, very decentralized, also a heavily agricultural economy. Most people are peasants. To be honest with you, most people remain peasants after the Renaissance, though, although we do see a new class emerge. Kind of an urban merchant class begins to emerge. And we also see the beginnings of what becomes ultimately a capitalist style economy down the line. Also, we start to see increasing political centralization during the Renaissance, where in many places in Europe, though not all, Italy being an exception, the Holy Roman Empire being an exception, but a lot of other places, like for example, England, France, Spain, so on, they end up becoming much more politically centralized, where increasingly the king's power starts to become more and more and more absolute in nature as we move forward towards the 1600s later on down the line. So we're seeing some political centralization. We're seeing kind of combining of regions. For example, in Spain, the king and queen of King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile end up combining their kingdoms into a single Spanish kingdom, for example. And in the medieval era, I think it stands to reason that you really had the Roman Catholic Church during the late Middle Ages had this real stranglehold on society. It really determined everybody's reality in a lot of ways. I mean, there was no escaping the influence of the Roman Catholic Church at any level or at any geographic location in society. Its influence over humanity was palpable. Okay, and but as we move into the Renaissance period, we see new thinking arise, and we start to see people begin to not just live and think about their existence on this earth as the stepping stone to the afterlife, but rather during the Renaissance, we see a focus shift to the contributions of humanity, of your earthly existence, of those things that humans can accomplish, okay? And we're going to talk about that because it's all wrapped up in this idea of humanism. What time does this class end again? Does it end at 9? So I still have a half hour to talk? I always get confused on the times here. I just want to make sure that I'm not going over. I think it ends at 9. Yeah, okay, good. So excellent, because I have a lot more than I want to talk about. So let's continue to move forward. I am now on slide 3 of the Renaissance PowerPoint. Okay, perfect. Thanks so much, guys. So Renaissance art very much celebrates human dignity and beauty, okay? And what we're really talking about here is this new literary movement, I guess we'll call it, of humanism, okay? And humanism isn't just extended to literature, isn't just limited to literature, it's also extended to art and so on. Now, if you take a look at this piece here, you can see, and it's a very high resolution image, so it might seem to you like there's cracks in it and stuff. That's because you're looking at about a 600-year-old painting, okay? And the canvas that it's painting on is not a perfectly smooth surface. So she doesn't have a bunch of wrinkles or things on. It's the medium upon which this is painted, okay? If you take a look at her and ignore the fact that the canvas that she's painted on isn't perfectly smooth, she has absolutely flawless features, okay? Her face is perfectly symmetrical. Her skin is perfectly smooth. Her clothing is, immaculate. Her hands are perfectly positioned, okay? And she has this look on her face that gives her a whole lot of emotional, what's the word that I'm looking for? Like emotional conveyance, okay? Why is this significant, all right? Let me tell you one trick about describing art. It would be, when I've been teaching this class a while, and when I ask students to describe Renaissance pieces, one of the first words that I hear kids use to describe it is, oh, she looks really realistic. Okay, really realistic. Yes and no. Okay, yes and no. I will concede that this painting, okay, this portrait of a lady here from 1460, I will concede that this painting makes the subject appear far more lifelike. I will concede that. But it would be inaccurate to describe her as realistic, particularly for Renaissance art, and there's a reason for that. Okay, when we say something is realistic, I want you to consider what that means. Okay, in real life, do people have perfect skin? Do they have perfectly proportioned features? Are they looking perfect all the time? No, they're not. Especially if you realize that people of the 1400s were disgusting and they frequently went months on end without bathing. They were subject to all sorts of diseases, including smallpox, which would have left your face all scarred with pockmarks. Okay, people were not really very beautiful back in those days, if you don't mind my saying. All right, it's not like today where people get plastic surgery and, you know, they're half machine, half human, like the Kardashians or whatever else. Okay, people aren't perfect back in these times, and they're not perfect today. Okay, when you take your million different selfies to post the one that's the best on Instagram so you can get likes, you're looking for the one that tries to downplay the fact that you're not perfect. Okay, and nobody is. So if we say that she looks realistic, we're not really describing her accurately. Because if she was portrayed realistically, according to her time, she would have had pockmarks on her face. She would have had blemishes, okay, pimples or whatever, okay. She probably would not have been so fair-skinned, and so just understand that realistic isn't a great way to describe Renaissance art. Let me give you a better word to describe it: idealistic. Okay. Renaissance art is idealistic. You want her to look as perfect as possible. Renaissance art is about portraying humans to be the most magnificent creatures, perfect creatures on the planet. And once again, this is another major shift from late Middle Ages art, because late Middle Ages art was all about religion. Okay? As we move into the Renaissance, and there's this revitalization of understanding human achievement, okay? This understanding of the things that humans have done in their secular existence here on this earth, as opposed to simply living for the afterlife. What we see reflected in the art is that we start looking at new subjects. So instead of there just only being art about, baby Jesus and the Madonna, or art that's surrounding solely religious themes. All right, it could be art that's about parables in the Bible or whatever else, but mostly Jesus. Okay, we see the art shift to being more about everyday subjects. Not maybe everyday subjects, high-ranking everyday subjects though, but also to other things, Greek and Roman gods. Okay, particularly Roman gods, and so on and so forth. So we start to see new subjects in art and in literature that aren't necessarily just all religious stories pertaining to the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, so she's portrayed more perfectly on canvas than she ever could have appeared in real life. And for that, she is not realistic. She is more lifelike in some respects, but she is actually idealistic. You guys learning anything yet? Okay, let's talk about the Italian Renaissance. Two events coincide with the start of the Italian Renaissance. The death of Petrarch, who's on the right, who is sometimes known as the father of humanism, and the death of a guy named Giovanni Boccaccio, okay, author of something called the Decameron. Now, after these two guys die, that's when historians have more or less designated the beginning of the Italian Renaissance. Thereafter, there was a major spread of this Florentine, meaning from Florence, of or related to Florence, which is the original home of the Renaissance, okay? Florentine humanist cultures. And this combines with civic reform to create something called civic humanism. And it ends up basically coming to a close with the Spanish imperials sacking Rome right around 1527. So when we talk about the Italian Renaissance, we're talking about a century and a half period of time. And the other thing that you'll notice in the questions that you were asked for today is that the Renaissance art is divided into kind of like early Renaissance, actually proto-Renaissance maybe even would be a better word. Proto-Renaissance. If you've ever heard of a prototype is like a mock-up design of what ultimately will one day down the line become a finished product. Okay, when we talk the proto-Renaissance, we're talking about a period of time where we're not quite to the Renaissance yet, but we're starting to see features of what the Renaissance is probably going to encompass. Talk a little bit about that later. And then we talk about early Renaissance figures, high Renaissance figures, and then down the line, the Renaissance kind of transitions into a new art form called Mannerism. However, this is two images here, and what I'm going to have you do right now, because we are talking about Petrarch, okay, I want to delve a little bit more into this notion of humanism. I'm going to tell you something. I hope that if there's anything that you listen to today, it's this, okay? There are three features. There are three big ideas, if you will, okay? Three big ideas accompanied with the Renaissance that I would encourage you to commit to your memory, okay? If you will, movements or topics or ideas that would be really good to consider as being the best ways of describing how the Renaissance was indeed a shift away from the late Middle Ages. Those three things are, number one, humanism, okay? Humanism. Number two, secularism, okay? Number three, individualism, okay? Those three ideas, humanism, secularism, individualism, those three words are the keys to understanding the Renaissance, all right? So I hope that you can remember that and be thinking about how, now if you were to just show up on a test and say, oh, how was the Renaissance different? Oh, it was humanism, secularism, and individualism. That's not good enough, because you need to be able to describe what those words mean. How did they manifest in the Renaissance? That's the thing that we're going to be working through right now, is to talk to you a little bit about how that humanism manifests. Now, these words, to be honest with you, there's some cross-sectionalism between these words. The words relate to themselves, one another, in some respects. Okay, so but just be thinking about, if I was taking a test right now, or if I was writing an answer to a question right now, how would I describe why humanism, or how humanism manifests in the Renaissance? And the first thing that we're going to do to begin to make sense of that is to spend a little bit of time right now taking a look at a primary resource document. So if you go back to Canvas, go to Files, there's a folder in there that I've put on there called Primary Resource Docs. And I would like you to open up the one that says Petrarch, it's 04 Petrarch Excerpts. Okay, so go ahead and open that one up. And we're going to go ahead and read through the beginning part together. And I got to pull this up on my screen here. Petrarch excerpts. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Petrarch. Petrarch, often labeled the father of humanism, Francesca Petrarca, 1304 to 1374 CE, just means common era, was born at Arezzo in Tuscany. Tuscany is right around Florence. Okay, it's like the area right around Florence. All right. He was initially called Francesco di Petraccio after his father, a notary who a few years earlier had been expelled from Florence, along with Dante, who's another figure of the kind of this period of like the proto-Renaissance. In deference to his father's wishes, Petrarch studied law, first at Montpellier and later in Bologna. The Center of Juridical Learning. I'm sorry, I'm not reading this very well because it's very small on my screen. In deference to his father's wishes, Petrarch studied law, first at Montpellier and later in Bologna, the Center of Juridical Learning. However, Petrarch's desire was to become a man of letters. A man of letters is like a poet, okay, a literary guy. When his father died, leaving an insignificant inheritance, Petrarch had little choice but to become a priest. In 1327, the sight of a woman called Laura brought from him an outpouring of passion in Italian sonnets for over 20 years. The subject was a married woman whose identity is obscure. It is possible that she and Petrarch actually never met. In fact, one gains the impression that the poems may not be addressed to an individual, but an abstract concept of women in general. Nevertheless, Petrarch's consummate skill in the sonnet as a new form of poetry conquered Europe, so much so that this became the preferred form for poets such as Ronsard, Gongora, Spenser, and Shakespeare. At a public coronation in 1341, he received the poet's laurel crown on the steps of the Capitol in Rome. While remaining a devout Catholic, and this is an important thing right here, while remaining a devout Catholic, Petrarch had perhaps his most enduring influence by his reinitiation of humanistic studies. He collected manuscripts, readings, books essentially, that led to the recovery of knowledge from writers of Rome and Greece. The correspondence of Cicero, ancient figure, was one of his most important discoveries. In his enthusiastic dissemination of an ancient culture that focused on the pre-Christian idea of man as the measure of all things, Petrarch became the first humanist of the Italian Renaissance. As such, he instigated that process of change that gathered momentum in the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the American Revolution. Some short extracts are given below from Petrarch's letters and from his Life of Solitude, where Petrarch composes work. Okay, so what I'm going to have you do right now, we don't have a ton of time, you know what? I'm just going to go through this with you because we don't have a ton of time and I don't want to sit here in silence. So he's writing a letter to this other guy that we talked about just a moment ago in the PowerPoint. So this is a letter written by Petrarch to Boccaccio. Now, as we start to read this, I want you to think about another tool that I'm going to teach you about, And I will put this onto Canvas today, and this will be perhaps part of your assignment for today, actually, or for Friday. It's called Hippo, Hippo. Hippo. This is like Persia, another tool that you can use to analyze documents, but it's a little bit different. Whereas Persia's talking about the different historical lenses or angles that you can look at an issue, Hippo is more about looking at the historical context, looking at who the audience of this thing is, looking at the purpose of the document, looking at the point of view of the person who wrote the document. It's a little bit more individualized to the particular thing that you're looking at, whether it's a map or a piece of art or a textual document or a poster or whatever it is. So let's read this together, and I have about 15 minutes to do this. So here we go. He's writing to Boccaccio, another educated guy. This is Petrarch's words. He goes, I come to that part of your letter which so affected me on first reading. You say that a certain Peter of Siena, noted for his piety, meaning his religious devotion, and for the miracles which he performed, has recently died. So this guy, Peter of Siena, known for being this really pious guy, and even known for performing some miracles, died. And that on his deathbed, he had something to say of both of us, meaning both Petrarch and of Boccaccio. Now, obviously, he's responding to a letter that Boccaccio had written him earlier. And that this guy, Peter of Siena, sent a messenger to you to communicate his last words. And you were informed that your life is approaching its end and that but a few years remain to you. Secondly, you were bidden to renounce, to give up the study of poetry. Hence your consternation and sorrow, which I shared. A little reflection will serve to efface your concerns, meaning reduce your concerns. A little reflection, he's saying, if you take a step back and just reflect a little bit, this will serve to smooth over your concerns, if you will but listen to the utterances of your own better reason. Now, I want you to think about that for a second, okay? I want you to think about this for a second. Typically, an educated person of this time, if they were concerned with something, if they were upset by something, what would probably be the most likely advice that you would give to someone? Well, there's a passage in the Bible that fits with this. Remember chapter 4, verse 7, okay? He doesn't do that, does he? He doesn't do that. And this right there is secularism. He's saying, listen to your reason, individual reason. Don't consult the Bible. Listen to your own better reason. And you will see that instead of being a source of grief, that this man's message ought to give you joy. Now that is right there so profound, okay? Because it was so different from the vast majority of insight of people at that time. It's putting an emphasis on the ability of humans to use reason to reflect, all right? So let's move on. Boccaccio, and remember, Boccaccio is not anti-religious. He's a devout Catholic, all right? So it's not just like you're either religious or you're secular. The idea is that he's religious while at the same time valuing human secular contribution, okay? So let's move on. I do not belittle the authority of prophecy. What comes to us from Christ must indeed be true. Truth itself cannot lie. But I venture to question whether Christ was the author of this particular prophecy, or whether it may be, as often happens, a fabrication, in other words, a lie, attributed to him in order to ensure its acceptance. So what he's saying here is listen to your reason. This guy, Peter of Siena, noted for his piety, his religious devotion, noted for the miracles that he performed, sends this messenger to Boccaccio to tell Boccaccio, you're going to die soon, okay? The prophecy tells it. Petrarch's response to that is, hey, look, prophecies happen. Okay, look at Christ. What comes from Christ must be true. However, let's take a look at this situation for a second. Maybe this guy is attributing something to prophecy from Christ in order to ensure that people will believe it, when in fact, this guy is a liar. Okay, so he goes, he continues on. Listen to what he says. And boy, oh boy, kids, this is why this is so good. Listen to this quote here. This is an amazing quote. Put this in your Instagram profile. For it is an old and much used device to drape one's own lying inventions with the veil of religion and sanctity in order to give the appearance of divine sanction to human fraud. Okay, that is a fantastic quote. He's saying people have for centuries been trying to drape things up in religion, drape things up in sanctity, drape, whatever it is, in order to give the appearance so that people will believe it, that it somehow should be believed, but it's in fact a product of human fraud. He says, I might commend to you, meaning recommend to you, I might commend to you in your perplexity the reflections of Virgil. Once again, he doesn't say go to the Bible and look up chapter 4, whatever, okay? He says go to the reflections of Virgil, an ancient poet, okay? An ancient Roman poet, as not only helpful, but as the only advice to be followed at this juncture. This prohibition against poetry filled me with much more astonishment than the first part of the dying man's message, this Peter of Siena guy. Okay, I cannot understand why such advice should be given to an educated person in the full possession of his faculties, one who realizes what can be derived from such studies for the fuller understanding of natural things, for the advancement of morals, and for the advancement of eloquence. He goes on to say, believe me, many things are attributed to gravity and wisdom, which are really due to incapacity and sloth, laziness, okay? Men often, another fantastic quote. Oh my gosh, guys, this one's filled with golden lines. Listen to this. Men often despise what they despair of obtaining, meaning they hate the things they cannot have, okay? It is indeed the very nature of ignorance to scorn what it cannot understand. Okay, it is in the very nature of ignorance to scorn what it cannot understand and to desire to keep others from attaining what it cannot reach. If you ever go on YouTube and you see people making little snide comments, okay, particularly for content that like is original content or something like that, I have to look at that and just laugh because it makes that person seem so pathetic, okay? It makes them seem like, they have nothing better to do but to just go on and hate on someone or thumbs down things and stuff like that. What kind of negativity does that, what does that show? It doesn't make the person who makes it feel bad. It makes you feel bad for the person who makes those comments because it's like the only reason they would do it is because they obviously despair of obtaining it themselves, okay? Yet neither exhortations to virtue nor the argument of approaching death should divert us from literature. For in a good mind, it excites the love for virtue and dissipates, or at least diminishes, the fear of death. He's saying obtaining an education, becoming an educated man or woman in modern day times of letters, okay, makes it so that you create this love of virtue, of wisdom, okay, and at least diminishes, if not completely gets rid of, your fear of death. To desert our studies shows want of self-confidence rather than wisdom. For letters do not hinder, but aid the mind which possesses them. Properly constituted mind which possesses them. They facilitate our life. They do not retard it, meaning slow it down. Cato, I never forget, once again quoting ancient poetry, acquainted himself with Latin literature as he was growing old, and Greek when he had become a really old man. Varro, who reached his 100th year, 100 years old, still reading and writing, parted from his life sooner than from his love of study. It seems to me, although the path to virtue by the way of ignorance may be plain, it fosters sloth. And the last line, kids, this is the zinger. Okay, this is the zinger. Ignorance, however devout, Ignorance, however devout, is by no means to be put on a plane with the enlightened devoutness of one familiar with literature. That is an unbelievable line, okay? And it's encouraging to hear these words coming from somebody who existed nearly 700 years ago in history, encouraging people to pursue an education, to question, to read, to develop a love of learning, not for the sake of anything that has to do with divinity, but for the sake of appreciating humanity, okay? And that, folks, is humanism, and that's where we'll leave off today. Have a great day.